Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Fulton, the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here at Rice University, and I want to welcome you to the Kinder Institute's second annual State of Housing in Harris County and Houston webinar. Today is the day we release the 2021 State of Housing in Houston and Harris County report. It's available on the website now, and we're going to briefly highlight the reports. This will only be an hour, and then we'll have a discussion among people who are working on the ground on affordable housing in Houston to talk a little bit about the results of our report and what they see going on out there. Before we start, I want to say special thanks to Wells Fargo. For the second year in a row, Wells Fargo has been the primary sponsor of the State of Housing report. We are very grateful for their support and for supporting today's webinar. As I said, I'm welcoming you now. Luis Fajardo will present the report's findings. We'll have a panel conversation with three panelists. Let's move on to the presentation of the report's findings. And I'd like to begin by introducing Luis Fajardo, who is the Urban Policy Research Manager at the Kinder Institute, and he was the primary project manager for the State of Housing report. Luis is now going to give us a short presentation summarizing some of what we found. Luis? Are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, welcome everybody to this year's State of Housing webinar. As briefly stated, the purpose of the report is really it's important to our region. We think it's a baseline of housing data to local policymakers and community members and housing stakeholders. We strive to provide information about housing in one spot each year through this report to inform policy, development, and future research pursuits here too at the Kinder Institute. And so we hope that this information is useful in your work and in your endeavors. And lastly, I will say, I think one of the big important parts of State of Housing is making neighborhood level data available to all. That's very important to the Kinder Institute. This work is aimed at supporting communities be more effective in the pursuit of equitable outcomes that build better cities and build better lives. Make sure to please visit our website, kinder.rice.edu, to access neighborhood level data. This information is going to be presented at the neighborhood level, where you can kind of toggle a lot of some of the more important indicators for this year's report at the neighborhood level and in an interactive fashion. You can also download the data from Kinder's Urban Data Platform at kinderudp.org. And there's also links in the interactive dashboard. You can also be taken to the Urban Data Platform, where you can download all of the data sets. Kinder researchers have poured over 200 plus data sets in demographics, household compositions, building permitting, lending, evictions, foreclosures, and more from sources like the US Census, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, tax appraisal records, the National Housing Preservation Database, and the Houston Association of Realtors, to put this together, to paint this story and get a good sense of what is occurring every year in our State of Housing for Houston and Harris County. So we invite you to make use of both the interactive data and or download the information. We will be providing updates on both of those fronts as more of the data becomes ready to share. And so right now there's over 200 plus indicators, but we will be including more as the days go by. So before we dive into the findings, I think it's important that we recognize the impact that the last year and a half has made. And so our communities have lived through a once in a lifetime pandemic. We have seen massive social unrest and calls for racial justice. We have had more disruptive and intense climate activity, not just here, but we're seeing this occur elsewhere throughout the world. Political tension around the 2020 election, and probably a lot more things that I may be forgetting at this moment with the year and a half that we've all lived. And we cannot understate some factors here. The economic fallout from the pandemic continues to raise the specter of evictions and homelessness. It's something that, and mortgage foreclosure as well. There have been some stopgap measures in place from the federal, state, and local governments in the last year and a half, but there remains some of this concern as the unemployment assistance is set to expire in Texas this week on June 26th, and then the federal eviction moratorium ends on June 30th from the CDC, and so there could be some lasting effects that go beyond now, right? And so we knew housing instability existed well before COVID. We also know that COVID has made the vulnerable yet more vulnerable to the next crisis, whether it's an economic collapse, a hurricane, or a winter storm. And in fact, this graph that you're seeing here on this chart that you're seeing on this slide is from the Kinder Houston area survey this year that found that over 28% of Houstonians had trouble paying for housing in the last year. This figure disproportionately rises when you look at Black and Hispanic households, which is at 40 and 37% respectively. And so the winter storm as well has had really a chilling effect on this region, and now we are seeing that there could even be energy shortages this summer with the heat, and so thinking about the impact of our infrastructure is also going to be very important. And just a heads up that the Kinder Institute is working with Harris County on doing an assessment of Winter Storm Uri's effects, and so keep an eye on that for late summer, early fall. There should be a report done to Harris County Commissioner's Court. One distinct way that housing is tied to the pandemic is in this issue of overcrowding. And I think that there's been a lot of confusion around urban density and housing crowding. Well, research finds, and those two are different, and so we've seen a lot of those myths dispelled. What we have really seen in the pandemic is that households that are overcrowded there is a significant overlap there with where the pandemic has been a lot more deadly, and that's how transmission has occurred even at the household level. Research finds that the highest COVID-19 death rates were in households with lower paying jobs where people prepare and harvest food, build homes, and sort goods in warehouses. And so people with lower paying jobs were already struggling to find affordable housing options prior to 2020, and likely deciding to live with others to save money. And we actually saw this in the census data. This map that you see on the left is from the report itself, and shows that neighborhoods, these were neighborhoods where we see severely crowded housing, and that means that there's more than 1.5 persons per room. That constitutes a severely crowded household. There's an interesting overlap between the neighborhoods where that was highest and where we saw some of the highest COVID positivity rates during the summer peak in Houston last year. And so the map on the right. And so this is one of the findings that I think was really, interesting to us, was how rapid the increase was in 2018 to 2019, just prior to the pandemic, in seeing this rise in severely crowded households. Now on to the main findings of the report. We can kind of sum up, we're going to sum up some of them here, but I think this year's findings can really kind of be put into these three main buckets, which we're going to discuss with the panel as well, and are very relevant to this. So the first is that there's really two housing markets, one for owners and one for renters, and that's very apparent in a lot of the data from this report and a lot of what we found. It supports some of what we found last year as well, but it's certainly a stark kind of, it's a trend that is continuing. Second, that there's these differences between the city and the county. They're becoming a little bit more pronounced in population and household dynamics. And I'm going to get at that in a couple of slides to explain what that means exactly. And then third and not least important is that the next disaster really is a major threat to housing stability and our resilience as a community. And there are some really staggering statistics on that side that I think we need to grapple with too in knowing what we're dealing with. So when we're talking about two housing markets, home ownership is really becoming out of reach for renters. We see this, there's a widening gap between what a renter household earning the median income can afford and the median sales price. It's even more pronounced in Houston than in county overall. What you see in the gray columns here across the entire chart represents the price of a home that a renter or a homeowner can afford based on the median income of a renter or owner household. And so that's up to what that median renter or owner can afford. The orange, what you're seeing there is the deficit between what that group can afford and the median sales prices in either Harris County or Houston. And so for renters, what we are seeing in Harris County overall is that there's this $95,000 gap that is really making homeownership a lot more elusive for those who are renting. And that gap has grown exponentially. It's tripled since 2010 when we had the gap was around $35,000 and it's gone up to $95,000. So this is a trend that is concerning. Obviously in Houston, it's a much higher due to higher land values and higher home values and land prices, where we see the gap is at $140,000. And so I think we need to be mindful of these kinds of gaps as we think about why maybe we're becoming a lot more renter communities, right? But renters aren't just being locked out of home ownership. They're also facing a heavy cost burden when they rent. And so we see high monthly costs mean certainly more income is spent on housing, meaning less is spent for other needs such as education, healthcare, food, or starting a family or saving up to buy a house, right? And so in Harris County overall in 2019, 51% of all renters were cost burdened, which means that they were paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And when you break that down, when you look a little bit further, you see that the blue part of the far right column, that 24.2% of that 51%, that's the group that is paying, the share that is paying more than 50% on housing, which they're considered to be severely cost burden. And so you can imagine, you can really see here that it's not just that renters are being locked out of home ownership, but that certainly cost burdens are trending. They've been trending upwards from the 2010 numbers that we reported last year, but you can really see how stark the difference is from a homeowner household, and just how it may lead to a lot of housing instability. Low-income households feel this burden the most, and so when you look at these affordability challenges, you can see that it's concentrated really in households that are earning specifically less than $35,000 a year. So those three bars on the left of this chart, and $35,000 a year represents about 60% of the county's median income, just about that. And so for households earning under 60% of the median income, that's where it's really, really stark, where these cost burdens are really, really high. Even when you look at 60 to 80%, which is this $35,000, this middle bar, to $49,000, which is about 80% of the county's median income, you have about 52% of the households are cost burden in that income bracket, which is also modest, but certainly that just means that there's not sufficient affordable housing supply at those lower levels to keep up with the demand that lower income Houstonians have. And I think where public subsidy can make the biggest impact is what you're seeing is that it's really underneath that 60% threshold. And so, you know, it's when we talk about the rental housing markets and this housing instability, it also really Harris County is a national leader in evictions, right? And so this is a concern here. No single county had a higher eviction rate than Harris County nationally. In the major metro areas, only New York City had more total evictions from 2018 to 2020. But New York City is spread throughout 5 counties and has twice as many people and has a much larger share of renter households. In Harris County, 1 in every 11 rental households had an eviction notice on their door in 2019. And in this year, 1 in 25 rental households got evicted. And so those numbers are pretty high. And when you look a bit further, we also see that the geography of evictions tells us a lot about where this is occurring. This is a much more somewhat suburbanizing problem than one may presume. But most importantly, a lot of these neighborhoods that are in orange, they're hugging the Beltway, which is the second loop around the Houston area, for those of you that are not familiar with Houston. And many of those neighborhoods are also areas where we see higher shares of immigrant communities and foreign-born populations. And so tenants may not know their rights or how to pursue counsel for an eviction filing. And so an eviction notice may lead to housing disruption that's not being captured in the data. And I think it's very important that we also recognize some of that. So Houston is a renter majority city. It's 60% renters and 40% homeowners, whereas Harris County, it's a little closer to 50-50. It's 53 to 47% owner to renter, as you can see on the chart on the left. And for a county and a city that has so many renters, we kind of know very little about data. There's just very little data on landlords, right? And so I think it's interesting to see that these shifts to in housing tenure have really been evolving since 2010. We've seen the share of renters grow exponentially. I think Houston was hovering at the 55%-ish, 54-55% threshold. 10 years ago, it's a lot, 60-40 now. And so these kinds of trends are interesting to grapple with. We've also just found that on the map on the right, Kinder researchers found that major real estate investment trusts, what are known as REITs in the real estate world, these corporate entities, they have a large presence in the county. And we kind of mapped a few of them just to see some of the largest ones to see where this is occurring. And to no surprise, it's a lot of the activity in blue that you see on that map is really overlaps with neighborhoods that are experiencing a lot of foreclosures. And so that a lot of that housing stock is shifting potentially from what used to be a homeowner trying to move into an affordable housing option. Now that housing stock, or some of that housing stock, is shifting over to rental properties. And so there's just a lot that I think we need to try to learn more about REITs and see, and not just REITs, but what kind of landlords are going to be servicing our population and what their financial characteristics are and needs as well. So looking more now at the housing dynamic situation, both Houston and Harris County over the long term have been gaining in population. I think we've all known that we've been a high growth area for many, many years. One census statistic that did throw us off a bit was that we noticed that from 2018 to 2019, in these census figures, the city of Houston actually lost 9,000 in population, even though there was an increase in 30,000 households, which you can see in the gray columns or bars here underneath. Houston again had a net gain of 30,000 households and lost 9,000 in population. And so, whereas the county gained overall, the county gained almost 15,000 in population. And so what this is really signaling is that the household composition is changing. We're going into smaller, much more smaller households, and that's happening a lot more rapidly than we might have imagined. And when you look a little bit under the hood at those numbers, you can kind of see that this growth, we can see the steep rise, particularly in people living alone. In Houston, the orange bar on the bottom had about a $25,000 household increase in households with people living alone. And so we can, that is a trend that we observed from 2010 to 2018, but from 2018 to 2019, it really much picked up the pace, and something to keep looking out for in future years as we kind of see the pandemic's impact on housing. So housing segregation and inequality limit upward mobility. This is, you can kind of see on the left and right, median household income is on the left. Subsidized housing is on the right. We can still see, obviously, that it remains disproportionately concentrated in under-resourced areas. And this also shows that a lot of our publicly assisted housing continue to reinforce racial and income segregation. And so I think overall, and so I think those are areas of opportunities that we might be able to work on to be able to change the upward mobility dynamic that we're seeing. When you also map affordable home ownership tools like the FHA mortgage, you can also see that a lot of the higher tracks where we have FHA mortgages are also in areas with lower incomes and higher poverty. And so those are things about how might the public sector and lending institutions kind of re-examine those two tools in the future and see what can be done with changing the geography of that. And last but kind of not least, of flooding is a growing risk. We know, we all have known this and we've lived through it in the region. And overall, the share of units in the floodplains is going down. So that is a big plus. But we did see about 2,000 homes built in the floodplains in 2019, and I think these are figures that I think we just need to be looking out for too in the near future as we're looking as we're trying to build a more resilient region with about nearly $30 billion worth of residential property located in the floodplain. I think there's a lot here to chew on. Which poses significant threat to people who are trying to build intergenerational wealth and the fiscal and just kind of this fiscal sustainability of the region as we go forward. So, and here is a map just of where our residential structures are compared to the floodplains. And so just a reminder to add your questions in the Q&A box and we will try to get to them. And here are the links. We'll come back to this as well. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it off now to Bill and our excellent panel to have an interesting conversation about housing this year.
Okay, thank you, Luis. And I want to say to our staff, to our panelists, and to the attendees for this lively discussion going on in both the chat and the Q&A. Before we get started with the panel, Luis, there's just one or two technical questions for housing nerds. One question was, the overcrowding data was from the 5-year American Community Survey, 2015 to 2019. Is that correct? Do you recall? That was a question.
We have both. So at the neighborhood level, if you go to the dashboard, it's at the 5-year level. It's a 5-year ACS estimate. And in the report, we're doing a comparison from 2018 to 2019. And so we used 1-year estimates.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
So that was not the same, that wasn't COVID year, but it was close, right? And then there was another question of whether the income data used here is gross or net. RJ Wu responded gross. And there was a question about private equity coming in. Zoe Middleton, one of our panelists, answered that. We appreciate that. We'll get back to the questions after the panel. If I could ask the panelists now, maybe Luis, in a minute we can unshare the screen, or we'll just go to the, or Sarah, we'll just go to the panel members in a second. The panel members are Zoe Middleton, the Houston and Southeast Texas co-director at Texas Housers, which is a housing advocacy group. Ben Hirsch, the co-founder of West Street Recovery, which is a grassroots group that was formed after Harvey to help particularly underserved communities become more resilient. And Carolyn Rivera, a resident partner at West Street Recovery and who is a resident of Sedagast. So let's begin. We have a little bit of time for this conversation. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's begin by asking each of the panelists just a little bit about how affordable housing, even though Houston has a reputation for being affordable, that reputation is probably best deserved, as Luis said, among homeowners. Renters are getting more and more stressed. But home ownership, home prices are also going up and have been in the last year as they have been elsewhere. I'm just wondering, for each of the three of you, how do you define dignified affordable housing, and what do you take away from this? You know, how have you dealt with this in your own personal life and in your professional life, and what do you take away from the report as what needs to be done? Zoe, let's begin with you.
So I think, you know, dignified and affordable means something different to everyone, right? So it really depends on your income and asking the question of affordable to who. And we know that Houston is not affordable to very low income people or even low and moderate income people. There's quite a squeeze in the market. We're actually the second least affordable city or region behind Las Vegas for very low income people. And we know that our economy doesn't pay people enough to survive and live in living wage. But we also know that these are important members of our community, and they support this market that we currently exist in. And as for dignified, I think Luis touched on the issue of overcrowding, but there's also a real problem in the rental stock with code enforcement, which is finally getting some movement at the city level, and some action that will be moving through the Housing and Community Affairs Committee. But code enforcement, you know, in the full report, you see that the glut of the housing, there was a massive construction boom, you know, during the oil boom, and we see that we haven't built as much, like 1982 is the peak year for building multifamily in Houston. And so we have a lot of that stock that is hitting the 40-year mark and is having to withstand, you know, severe regular rains, extraordinarily high temperatures that burden the utility infrastructure around the multifamily stock, all in an environment where there is little meaningful code enforcement. And so you see this real problem with mold and other health impacts that people have to deal with in the rental stock, as well as in the kind of like vulnerable homeowner stock. So I think that when we talk about dignified housing, it also needs to be healthy housing. It needs to be appropriate for the family that intends to live in it or the household that intends to occupy it. So it can't also be overcrowded.
Thanks. And as you said, Zoe, that this city and this region are extremely dependent on those older rental multifamily apartments that are aging and possibly not in very good shape. That's an enormous looming issue for this region, bigger, I think, in this region maybe than elsewhere.
And
Ben, go ahead.
I'll just say that there is a trend here of those kind of beleaguered multifamily units actually being purchased by REITs, which I know we'll talk about later, right. But it's something that's very, very disconcerting.
Right. Yeah. And Ben, what's your perspective on this? And please tell us a little bit about West Street Recovery along the way.
Okay, my name is Ben. Thanks for everyone who's joining and this awesome panel. So West Street Recovery was formed immediately after Harvey, and we've been working for 3 or 4 years to try to help people who are really excluded from the disaster recovery apparatus, from receiving assistance from the major institutions, including, for example, FEMA and the United Way, to get those families the help they need to put their lives back together and to return to dignified, safe, we say safe, sanitary, and secure housing, which is a little more measurable than dignified, perhaps. And We have found along the way that basically the job of doing disaster recovery is going to be impossible unless we use the recovery to try to build a more just economy and just society overall. So that has been why we do, that's why we don't just swing hammers, but we also do policy advocacy, and more importantly, try to build community power to attack these issues. So we've been working a lot on flood mitigation, which is a huge threat. The health of housing stock, so the presence of mold and toxics in people's homes. And then also the, environmental justice crisis in Houston, the largest cancer cluster, Chevron, Exxon, BP, spewing toxics into the air, into the ground, and the state of sort of deregulation and simultaneous disinvestment in low asset Black and brown communities in Houston. And also the sort of the need for real thorough democracy in Houston and in our institutions to be able to represent more people in the policy. So I think you'd see in the housing policy, very few actually poor people have any influence on housing policy. And we will continue to have an affordable housing crisis unless that changes. So the real estate sector cannot solve the affordable housing crisis. They don't want to solve the affordable housing crisis. So that's, that's like kind of where we come from. And yeah, I'll pass it to Ms. Rivera because I think she has more relevant things to say.
Let's move on to Ms. Rivera. You have become a housing activist. You live in Sedegast. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved and what some of the issues are that you see on the ground in communities such as yours.
Okay, good morning. This is Carolyn. Yes, number one, I have lived in this community over 40 years. And during that time, we have seen a lot of deterioration because of the lack of equity from the government. In the area that I work with and live in, there are basically older people, people who are disabled, single families with children, and we are suffering from this continuous environment deterioration. We have air pollution from our medical recycling plant, 18-wheelers, and so forth in this area. Dignified, affordable housing, I see it as, whether I see it or not, it is where people can maintain and have a clean environment. The housing challenge is getting to the people who need help. And the best way to interact with people living in vulnerable situation is to go to them, talk to, and listen to them. And we can alleviate the situation by working together as a group with city, county, state, and federal government. I hope I'm new at this, but I'm learning.
we're
excited about learning, and I hope I answered your question based on the information that you need.
Well, we do appreciate your perspective and your participation. I wanted to swing back to some of the other panelists now and ask. I wanted to ask, for example, Ben, we have seen play between the disasters and the housing stock, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. what have we learned about better disaster preparedness, and what is resilience? What does better resilience in these neighborhoods look like?
Oh, I'm so excited you asked me that question. So I just want to highlight a few connections, which is one, if you look at the maps in this report of where evictions, the highest rate of evictions, that's also the same area that West Street Recovery works in. If you look at the rate of tax foreclosures, that's Setagast, that's the highest area in Houston where Ms. Rivera lives. And there is additional pressure on the housing stock from these disasters. So 100,000 units of housing were flooded during Harvey. No one has chosen to count how many houses were damaged by Winter Storm Uri. I mean, I think there's a concerted silence on that issue, how many people lost water access, how many people had damaged homes. And so the first thing we need to do for disaster preparedness is to really, accept the fact that disasters are not rare events. They're not rare events in Houston. We've had 6 500-year rain events in the last 20 years, which makes you understand that they aren't actually 500-year events. I'm a recovering statistics person, and that starts to be outside of what's likely. But in terms of disaster preparedness, I think there's two things. There's community level preparedness that really needs to happen. We need to be working to identify people that are the most vulnerable, who have severe medical conditions, who are disabled, who are too elderly to move on their own. And we need to provide those people the resources to survive these disasters. So I know that sounds bleak, and it's not the kind of optimistic Houston strong narrative, but we will recover better from disasters if the health impacts that people face from disasters are minimized. And they can be minimized by some pretty simple interventions. If you need electrical equipment to keep a medical device on to survive, the city of Houston and the county could provide you a battery, a battery that can withstand for 48 hours, or a generator. Those are things that are within the realm of government intervention. There's no serious efforts to do so. I mean, I want to say that again, there are no serious efforts to do so, and there really need to be. And then the other thing, and communities can be really important in that, in identifying, they know who's vulnerable. They know the old people in their neighborhood. They know the person in a wheelchair, whether or not they're documented or undocumented or unbanked or unregistered as a voter. Their neighbors know them. So that's really important. And the second thing is we majorly need, gray and green infrastructure to protect. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that flooding is the biggest threat to Houston. Last night in our community chat, people were sharing pictures of their yards full of water. The storm last night will have no name. No one will remember it in 2 weeks. And people almost flooded again. There are some design, so we need that gray and green infrastructure. We need the GLO to send us the money that they should send us, which I think people in this audience probably know about. We also need the county to make true on its promise to deliver equity with the flood bond, which the Houston Chronicle revealed they are not particularly close to doing. And we need, when we repair homes and when we build homes, we need to take the flooding and wind threat seriously and do things like put in tile floors, put in more hard which is mold resistant, elevate electrical outlets to 36 inches, for example. All these things are pretty small interventions that can really reduce recovery time. And we know the shorter the recovery time is, the better families are able to survive the health and wealth impacts of disasters. So shortening that recovery time.
Right. I want to make sure everybody's in the conversation. I want to get back to Ms. Rivera with one more question. You got involved after Harvey. What kinds of, with both Harvey and the winter storm, what kinds of issues did you see in your neighborhood, and how was your neighborhood able to mobilize to deal with those issues? So, is mold, for example, still an issue in the homes in your neighborhood?
Yes, we are still working to repair homes from Harvey. that, in fact, just recently, I think within the last week or two, a neighbor had her home redone. And like Ben has said, the storms and the floods are just extensive, just and devastating and destructive. And every time we have a storm or like a torrential rain like we had last night, there is added destruction to what has already been destroyed. And so this is continuing to build up through the years, and it's causing very real problems. And it's just like Ben had said earlier, you know, especially for my area, the older, disabled, vulnerable, low-income people, you'll hear people make comments like, well, they should have had insurance. But what people don't know is that many of us do have insurance, but insurance companies will turn us down saying it was related to God, you know. FEMA turned us down with insurance. I have insurance, but my deductible is kind of large. So I went to FEMA to see about its assistance. So they turned me down. My neighbor, who had no insurance, she was also turned down. So therefore, our resources are very limited for meeting the needs of our house and homes as far as safety is concerned. And that's where Sear and West Street Recovery has come to our aid when we informed them. So what I did in the community in order for them to know the people that were most vulnerable, I got to know my neighbors, find out what was going on, and then report it to them, and they would meet the need. But it was not just me. We worked together as a group and as a community to locate people that were having trouble. In fact, one lady we located had not had any water since the Arctic blast because all of her pipes broke, and she could not find help. And so I found out about her through another neighbor, and then we forwarded the information, and that was just within the last month. So she went, and she was disabled. So these are the things that we run into often here. And also I want to bring up, as far as the community is concerned, our ability to breathe clean air. That is another very real problem. Saturday, we from the community went out on a bike ride to check the quality index level for air. It was sponsored by Air Alliance and Plume's Lab, and it was about 70 plus of us on bicycles Saturday that rode through the neighborhood with these devices. And it was amazing the hazardous and unclean air that we breathe.
If you don't mind, Ms. Rivera, I think we do need to get back to talking about housing, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to Zoe. I'd like to ask you, particularly Zoe, we are now in almost a renter majority county. We are in a renter majority city. What what do we know about large landlords, small landlords, new investors such as the REITs that were discussed, and what policy tools are available to help, particularly the smaller landlords who have had a difficult time during COVID?
So I just put this in the chat, and I'm going to find a way to weave it into this response. But there's a huge gulf of experience between policymakers and politicians and the people living with these burdens, be they climate disasters or the pre-COVID eviction crisis or the COVID eviction crisis. And in order to solve that problem, we don't only need data. We don't have enough data on landlords, but we also need political will. So when we think about answering your question about what do we know about these landlords across the city of Houston and across Harris County, we know far too little. We know, who is a member of what association and who isn't part of a certain PAC or this or that, but we actually don't know enough about unless you want to pay a lot of money to a certain data companies, real estate data companies, and then you still get patchwork data and you don't get a sense of the lived experience. But we don't know enough about, which LLCs are actually all owned by the same umbrella company. We don't know enough about where private equity backed, landlords are, because there are just so many of them, and they're in very complicated legal structures. And we don't know enough about small holding landlords. And these are the kind of landlords people often call them mom and pop landlords, and they often get put up as kind of a front for what are actually larger corporate interest landlords. And we say, well, we can't do XYZ in terms of an event prevention policy or a stabilization policy for renters, because what about mom and pop renters? Meanwhile, there is never policy written explicitly for those mom and pop landlords, and they don't act as a significant political bloc.
So what do you think are some of the policy options that, what if one can identify mom and pop landlords? What do you think?
A landlord registry for the city of Houston. And there's a reason, Briscoe Keene, the last legislation, had a bill that would have prevented a landlord registry in every.
Okay, so a landlord registry.
So a landlord registry is absolutely essential. And I think that's the first way for us to understand, who is in charge of our housing supply. And then I think also understanding the political alliances within is really important as well.
And what policies could the city or the county pursue that would actually, once you identify who those small landlords are, that can help them?
Yeah, so you can develop programs like recovery programs or utility cost burden alleviation programs. We know that there are a lot of single family rentals are actually, concentrated in Fifth Ward, and they have, weaker household infrastructure, right? So a lot of burst pipes and that kind of thing. You can design a special repair program just for them. And you can even, if you wanted to put this in the Federal Register, you could even design special programs for single family, small holding landlords to ensure that, the families renting those are able to recover better.
Okay, we have a few minutes left and we have a ton of questions. So I'm going to start going through some of the questions. And Luis, if you wouldn't mind turning yourself back on, because some of the questions may be to you. Bridget Jensen asks, I know this is about housing, but seeing the eviction data that shows evictions near the Beltway, I'm thinking that these folks also have transportation hurdles. So she's curious about whether transportation and housing costs together is a problem, especially for renters. Anybody want to take that on, Luis, or anybody?
That's a very good point. We didn't isolate, or in this case, do a lot of overlaying of those two pieces of information, but we have studied it in different perspectives, and there is a lot of overlap. I would agree. The Kinder Institute and Link Houston partnered up for a report in about a year ago in 2020, where we kind of highlighted the overlap where affordable housing does exist and does not exist with quality affordable transportation. I think that report does have some findings. I'd be happy to share that with the panel, with the participant today.
Okay. A number of people are asking questions about why, Luis, you pointed out, and other panelists can respond too. Luis, you pointed out that in the city of Houston, we are seeing a decline in household size, more single person households. So we have this weird thing where the population is going down, but the number of households is going up. most of the new construction is aimed at the high end of that market. A lot of people a number of people have asked in a different way the question of what is driving that? Is that being driven by increasing older population, increasing younger population? What do we know about that?
Well, it's an interesting take because it was one that we weren't expecting to see as dramatic as it was, and so I think we did not isolate by age or race and ethnicity, but those are very good suggestions to drill deeper and see exactly where those occurrences are happening. There have been I do also want to emphasize there was an increase in the city of Houston of 7,000 family married couple households, and so it wasn't just an increase in people living alone. I think Houston is just attracting probably a much wider swath of household compositions. That said, more than half of the married couple families are residing elsewhere in Harris County. So while Houston doesn't dominate that, it is increasing too. So Houston isn't just increasing in people living alone or with unrelated. It's just that it's becoming a much more stratified, much more diverse household compositions in Houston, whereas in the county overall, we're still seeing, largely driven by married couple families, a lot more than anything else, much more than householders living alone or unrelated.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's another question here from Guadalupe Fernandez, and I want to expand on this question a little bit and ask all the panelists or whoever you want to respond. The question was, are there syndications available for non-accredited investors for folks to buy in multifamily buildings? I think the question there is, are there alternative ways for people to achieve home ownership or equity other than the traditional buying a single family house, because so many people are getting priced out of that, even in traditionally more modest neighborhoods? We've seen a community land trust set up in Houston. Do we see alternative ownership opportunities, Zoe, for people in Houston?
Yeah, so we have a growing, and we have the largest CLT, I think, in the country, which is an alternative ownership structure. And one day I would really like to see them move into multifamily kind of ownership opportunities, because I do think that is important for the densification. Sorry, thank you, Uyosa, in the chat, Community Land Trust. The densification of Houston, and acknowledging the fact that not everyone needs or wants or can afford the cost of a single family home. So I do think that is one thing that we're looking at, and that's possible.
Okay, good. I'm just scanning through the other questions. Kyle Abbott points out that houses are selling for 20 or 30% over listing prices. So maybe this isn't a problem. We have two housing markets, but it's getting increasingly difficult for home owners. Has home ownership ceased to be an option for a large number of Houstonians? And if so, is that a problem? Is that a problem we should address? Houston traditionally had a perception of being an ownership market, but in fact, the city and the county are mostly renter now. What do we do about that transition? Are there ownership opportunities, or are we stuck with a mostly rental city? And if so, what does that mean, and how do we approach that?
I think I'd like to take this. There are ownership options, right? But it's a matter of who has access to them. We see that denial rates are higher based on for Blacks and Hispanics. And we shouldn't have this fetishization around home ownership as the sole means for wealth building. You shouldn't wait to have the access or financial stability in order to have a secure place to live. And so how do we address the fact that we are moving towards nationally and regionally what is going to be a renter heavy nation, right? And we need to create better policy for renters, and that starts, with local policy in times of emergencies, like grace period ordinances and moratoria. But it also, we've already done a good job of keeping people stable with water shutoffs and that kind of thing. But I think that we also need to think about, the Texas Property Code as well as a major barrier to our ability, and our allocations from the feds as a major barrier to our ability to have a healthy rental market in Houston.
Okay. All right. Well,
Can I add one thing to that?
yeah, please.
Which is that the disasters really threaten low-income homeowners, which will put more and more pressure on the rental market. So when we think about things like just reducing the barriers to accessing assistance, we are also helping our rental market like stay healthy and helping people stay in those homes, which is just, it's an easy win in a really hard problem, and we should take it.
And I think we should be explicit about who is most at risk for these things. And there's absolutely a racial correlation. Like, we know that Black women nationwide are most harmed by the eviction crisis. We know who floods the most, we know who loses their homes the most, we know who gets evicted the most. So there's 100% a racial aspect here that we'd be remiss not to mention.
And Miss Carolyn, you fall into that category of a longtime homeowner whose neighborhood has been at risk. What kinds of steps could be taken to ensure greater resilience or greater ability to bounce back in your neighborhood in the future?
You mean steps by?
You tell me, by the government or anybody else?
Yes. Well, one of the steps I would say, equity, utilizing equity within our community. That's one thing that would help. And
Okay.
so is
right.
that along the line? Yeah.
Yeah.
For the our government officials to stop the inequity that goes on in our community.
And as Zoe indicated, there's a lot of inequity throughout, and this breaks along racial lines. Okay, it's just about 11 o'clock, so we are just about out of time here. We have lots of questions left. We will capture the questions and ask the panelists to answer the questions. I want to thank Luis Fajardo for presenting the report. I want to thank Carolyn Rivera, Ben Hirsch, and Zoe Middleton for participating in our panel. And I want to thank all of you. We had more than 400 people tune in today. Urban Reads will return on August 11th when Leslie Kern discusses her book, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. And then in October, Elizabeth Corver Glenn, who got her PhD at Rice, will discuss her new book, Race Brokers, which is about housing market segregation in 21st century urban America, but focuses on Houston. So thanks again to all of you for participating, and we'll get back to you on the questions, and have a good day.